Do you want to adopt a child? What? Ethan Whitmore's voice fractured in the silence. He startled as if someone had shaken him awake from a nightmare. His hand flew instinctively to his face, brushing away the tears that had not yet dried. He stood abruptly from the leather chair, the movement sharp, almost defensive. The living room was dim except for the fading glow of the fireplace. Shadows stretched across the high ceilings and stone columns of the Connecticut estate. Outside, wind pressed lightly against the windows, a late autumn chill settling over the manicured grounds. And there she was, Annie, 6 years old, barefoot, pink pajama sleeves slipping past her wrists, braids slightly undone from sleep. She stood near the archway, small against the vastness of the house. "Annie," he said, trying to steady his breathing. "What are you doing up? It's past midnight." "I'm sorry," she replied softly. "I didn't mean to scare you." His pulse was still racing. "You shouldn't be in here alone," he added, straightening his shirt cuff out of habit. "Does your mother know you came inside?" "She's asleep," Annie said. "She worked late. Maria always worked late." The grandfather clock ticked steadily behind them. Annie didn't move away. She looked at him carefully, as though measuring something. "You were crying," she said. Ethan stiffened. "No, I wasn't." She shook her head gently. "You were." He turned toward the fire, jaw tightening. "I've heard you before," Annie continued. "Sometimes when I wake up early, or when Mom is finishing the upstairs rooms." His shoulders slowly lowered. "You sit in that chair," she said, pointing, "and you hold your face." She covered her cheeks with her small hands, copying him without mockery. "And you say you're sorry," she went on. "You say you couldn't give Mrs. Clare a baby." The words entered the room quietly but landed with weight. "You say after 5 times. It shouldn't hurt this much," Annie added. "And you say the doctors tried 2 times with the science way, the IVF way, and it didn't work." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. 5 miscarriages, 2 failed IVF cycles, 7 losses that had carved silent space into the walls of this house. "I didn't mean to listen," Annie said quickly. I hear things." He lowered himself slowly back into the chair, the strength draining from his posture. "You heard all that?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "You always say it's your fault," she added. "That you couldn't give her a child." The word fault echoed in his mind. He had conquered markets, rebuilt failing companies, turned risk into triumph. Yet this had remained untouched by his power. "That's why I asked," Annie said. "Asked what?" he murmured. She met his eyes. "Do you want to adopt a child?" The question no longer startled him. It rested between them, simple, impossible. "Annie," he began carefully, "it doesn't work like that. There are courts, papers, lawyers." She listened without interrupting. He expected her to nod and step back. Instead, she walked forward. Before he could anticipate it, her small hand reached out and wrapped around his. The contact stopped him mid-sentence. He looked down. Her fingers were warm, certain. She lifted her face toward him, wide brown eyes, unguarded, searching. "Dad." The word was soft, not dramatic, not rehearsed, just spoken. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. For 40 years, no one had ever called him that. Board members had called him brilliant. Investors had called him fearless. The press had called him self-made. But this was different. He felt her grip tighten slightly, as though she feared he might pull away. "I just wanted to see," she whispered. "If it fit." The innocence of it broke something open inside him. His hand trembled in hers. He had stood in hospital corridors watching hope slip away in sterile silence. He had held Claire as she grieved children who never took a first breath. And now a living, breathing child stood in front of him, holding his hand as though it already belonged to her. His vision blurred again, but this time he did not turn away. He knelt slowly so that he was level with her. "Annie," he said, voice thick with emotion he could no longer disguise. "You don't have to test words like that." Her eyes searched his face. "I don't?" she asked. He shook his head gently. When she said it again, "Dad," softer this time, it did not feel like a question. It felt like an answer. His composure, so carefully constructed over decades, dissolved in the quiet of that room. He pulled her gently into his arms. She was light, fragile, real. The mansion around them, the marble floors, The tall ceilings, the empty nursery upstairs seemed to fade into the background. For the first time in years, the silence inside the house was no longer hollow. It was waiting. Ethan stayed on the carpet longer than he meant to, holding Annie the way you hold something precious you don't trust the world with yet. Her small arms circled his neck, not tight, not desperate, just certain. That certainty was what undid him. When he finally eased back, Annie didn't flinch. She didn't recoil like she expected punishment for being bold. She just looked at him, eyes wide in the low firelight, as if she were waiting for the next part of the story. Ethan cleared his throat. His voice came out rough. "You were hungry, you said?" Annie nodded. He stood carefully, keeping his movements slow, like he was learning to be gentle with his own body. "Come on, let's get you water. And something small to eat." Her eyebrows lifted as if she'd heard a promise adults often didn't keep. Ethan walked with her toward the kitchen, his hand hovering near her shoulder without touching. Not because he feared her, because he feared the moment, feared that if he moved too quickly, the fragile, astonishing thing that had just happened would shatter like glass. The kitchen lights were dimmed, but a soft under-cabinet glow lit the countertops. Ethan opened the refrigerator and stared for a second, blankly, at food he rarely thought about at this hour. Claire cooked when she could. The staff prepared meals when they couldn't. But late at night, the refrigerator felt like a museum of good intentions. He pulled out a small container of grapes, a yogurt, and a neatly wrapped sandwich left from dinner. Then he poured a glass of water and set it on the counter with a napkin, the way Claire always did small courtesies that made the house feel less cold. Annie climbed onto a stool, swinging her feet slowly. Ethan placed the grapes in front of her. "Start with these. Slow, okay?" She nodded with the seriousness of a child who had learned that slow mattered. While she ate, Ethan stood at the sink and watched the dark window above it. Outside, the yard lights illuminated the bare branches and the long driveway leading to the gate. Everything beyond that gate was a world he controlled with money, security codes, and lawyers. Yet there were things he could not command. He never had been able to. He heard the smallest sound, Annie's spoon tapping the edge of the yogurt cup, and it pulled him backward through time. 5 times, he could count them without thinking, the way a man counts scars. The first time, Claire had been laughing in the kitchen, barefoot, hair pinned up, the faint roundness of early pregnancy softening her waist. Ethan remembered touching her stomach like it might disappear if he pressed too hard. They'd told no one yet. A private secret, warm and glowing between them. Then the phone call. Then the drive to the hospital. Then the doctor's face, kind, apologetic, practiced. "I'm so sorry." Ethan had stared at the doctor's mouth as if the words were in a foreign language. Claire had gripped his hand so hard his fingers went numb. In the car afterward, she had whispered, "It's okay. We can try again." He believed her. He believed the world was fair enough to give them a second chance. The second time, Claire didn't laugh as much. She didn't buy the tiny yellow onesie Ethan had seen her holding in a boutique window. She refused to name the baby. She said, "Not yet." The third time, Ethan started coming home early. He canceled meetings, refused dinners with investors, stopped flying unless he absolutely had to. He became a man who counted days and watched Claire's face for any shadow. The fourth time, he sat in a hospital chair with his head in his hands while Claire stared at the ceiling, silent tears tracking into her hairline. She didn't say, "It's okay," anymore. The fifth time, she didn't cry. She just lay there, hollow-eyed, and asked in a voice so flat it frightened him, "What did we do wrong?" Ethan had wanted to shout at the universe, to smash something expensive, to write a check so large God himself would have to take it seriously. But he had only held her hand, because there was nothing else to do. Then came IVF. Ethan could remember the first consultation with the fertility specialist like he remembered mergers and market crashes. Bright office, soothing beige walls, pamphlets stacked like hope you could pick up and carry. The doctor had spoken calmly about statistics and protocols, about retrieval and transfer and success rates. Claire had nodded, dutiful, brave. Ethan had told himself this was finally something he could fix. They were Whitmores. They had resources. They could buy time, buy the best science, buy another attempt if the first failed. The first cycle failed anyway. Claire sat on the edge of the bed at home, holding the test in her hand as if it were radioactive. Ethan watched her shoulders collapse like a building losing its support. The second cycle failed too. After that, Claire stopped talking about baby names altogether. She stopped walking past the nursery at the end of the hall. She started leaving the house less. When she smiled, it looked like something she was borrowing. And Ethan began to sit in the living room at night, the lights off, his mouth forming words he didn't remember saying until he heard them echo back from the dark. "I'm sorry. I couldn't give you a child." He had blamed himself because blaming himself felt cleaner than blaming life. A small voice pulled him back to the present. "Sir?" Annie had paused with a grape between her fingers. "Are you mad at me?" Ethan turned quickly. No, sweetheart." He softened his tone, surprised at how natural the word sweetheart felt in his mouth. "I'm not mad." Annie studied him. "Then why are your eyes shiny?" He swallowed. The truth sat too close to the surface now. He could feel it pressing against his ribs. "Sometimes grown-ups get sad," he said carefully. "Even when nothing bad is happening right then." Annie nodded as if she understood more than she should. She picked up another grape and ate it slowly. Ethan watched her small hands, the way she wiped her fingers on the napkin without being told. Maria's training. Yes, but also something else. An instinct to keep things neat so no one would be annoyed. A child, learning to take up less space. It made his chest ache. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Then, footsteps soft, familiar. Claire appeared in the kitchen doorway in a robe, hair loose, face pale with sleep. She blinked at the scene. Her husband in rolled sleeves, a child on a stool, grapes and yogurt on the counter like a midnight picnic. Her gaze flicked to Ethan's face. She saw the redness around his eyes, the dampness he hadn't fully hidden. Then her eyes moved to Annie. Annie froze, spoon hovering midair. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Claire," she whispered, words rushing. "I was hungry and I didn't want to wake my mom and I." Claire crossed the room in 2 quiet steps and rested a hand lightly on Annie's shoulder. Not possessive, not performative, just steady. "It's okay," Claire said, voice husky from sleep. "You're not in trouble." Annie's shoulders loosened a fraction. Claire looked at Ethan. Her eyes asked a question she didn't speak out loud. Ethan's throat tightened again. He nodded once, small, almost imperceptible. His mind replayed the moment in the living room. Annie's hand on his, the soft word "Dad" breaking through decades of silence. Claire's lips parted. Ethan, he could have lied. He could have said she wandered in. He could have brushed it aside like an awkward incident. Instead, he let the truth stand between them. "She asked me something," he said quietly. Claire's eyes held his. What did she ask? Ethan inhaled, and for the first time in a long time he didn't try to control how it sounded. "She asked me if I wanted to adopt a child." The kitchen went still. Annie stared at her yogurt like it might save her. Claire's hand remained on Annie's shoulder, but it trembled slightly. Ethan watched Claire's face change surprise first. Then something deeper, older. Grief, yes, but also a flicker of longing so sharp it was almost painful to witness. Claire looked down at Annie. "Did you ask that, honey?" Annie nodded once, small and brave. "I heard him," she whispered. "I heard him crying." Claire closed her eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the weight of the last decade in one breath. When she opened them, they were wet. Ethan stepped closer to his wife. Not to comfort her the way he always did with careful words and controlled calm, but simply to be near her. Claire spoke softly, almost to herself. 5 times, her voice broke on the number, and 2 more with IVF. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from, and what part of Ethan and Annie's journey stayed with you the most. And if you believe in second chances, quiet courage, and the kind of love that finds us when we least expect it, subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story. Ethan didn't correct her, didn't fill the silence. He couldn't. Claire looked at him again, and her expression held something Ethan hadn't seen in a long time, a question that wasn't a medical one. Not how, not when, but why not? Annie's small fingers curled around the edge of the napkin. She glanced between them, waiting, afraid she'd said too much. Ethan saw that fear and made a decision in his bones before his mind could argue. He crouched beside Annie so he was level with her again. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said gently. "You asked a question. A big question. And I'm glad you asked it." Annie's eyes widened. Claire's hand slid from Annie's shoulder to the back of her braid. A careful stroke. A gesture that wasn't yet motherhood, but wasn't nothing either. Ethan stood and looked at Claire. "We should talk," he said quietly. "Tomorrow, with clear heads." Claire nodded, swallowing hard. Yes. In that moment, the mansion didn't feel like a monument to what they lacked. It felt like a place on the edge of becoming something else, something louder, messier, alive. Ethan guided Annie down from the stool. "Finish your water," he said, "and I'll walk you back to your room." Annie took the glass with both hands and drank in small, careful sips. As she did, Ethan glanced toward the dark hallway that led upstairs, toward the door at the end, where the nursery waited behind silence and dustless perfection. For the first time, he didn't see it as a room he had failed to fill. He saw it as a room that had been waiting for the right knock. And tonight, a 6-year-old girl had found the courage to knock twice. Claire didn't sleep after the kitchen. Ethan could tell, even without looking at the digital clock on his nightstand. There was a certain stillness to a person who was awake but refusing to move, as if motion might tip the balance of fragile thoughts. Beside him, Claire lay on her back with her hands folded over her stomach, staring into the dark like she was watching a movie only she could see. Ethan turned onto his side. "Claire." A pause. Then, quietly, "I'm here." He reached for her hand. She let him take it, but her fingers were cold. Down the hall, the house settled with soft creaks, the kind of old, dignified sounds that came from expensive wood and silent heating vents. Somewhere below, the last embers in the fireplace would be turning to ash. Ethan spoke carefully, like every word mattered. "About what Annie said." Claire's breath caught. "Don't," she whispered. "Not yet." He didn't argue. He knew the shape of her fear. He lived inside his own version of it. So he lay there, holding her hand, and listened to the distance between them fill with everything they'd never said out loud. At some point, Claire's grip tightened. "When she said it," she murmured, voice barely there, "I felt something." Ethan stared into the dark. "So did I." She turned her head slightly. "I'm scared." "Me too," he admitted. The honesty didn't solve anything, but it softened the room. Eventually, the exhaustion of months, years pulled Ethan into a thin, uneasy sleep. He woke before dawn to the smell of coffee. For a moment, he didn't recognize it. Coffee in this house usually came from a timer or from staff. Not from Claire. Not at 5:30 in the morning. He found her downstairs in the kitchen wearing a sweater over her pajama pants, hair pulled into a loose knot. She stood at the counter with 2 mugs, hands wrapped around one like it was a lifeline. She looked up when he entered. Her eyes were puffy, but clear. "Morning," she said softly. Ethan sat across from her at the island. The stone was cool beneath his forearms. He stared at the steam rising from his mug and tried to find his voice in it. Claire spoke first. "She's 6. "Yes," Ethan said. "She's Maria's," Claire continued, slow and deliberate, as if naming facts would keep them from dissolving into emotion. "She's been around us her whole life." "Yes." Claire's mouth tightened. "And she called you." She stopped. The word refused to pass her lips. Ethan swallowed. "She did." Claire looked down at her mug. "Ethan, I don't know if I can survive hoping again." He didn't rush to reassure her. He had promised too many things over the years with confidence that later turned into ash. So he answered with the only truth that felt stable. "Neither do I." Claire's shoulders sagged. "Then why am I even thinking about it?" Ethan leaned forward. "Because you heard her. Because you saw her face. Because—" His voice broke, and he forced it steady. "Because you wanted to believe it could be different." Claire closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, tears sat on her lashes but didn't fall. "I'm not worried about loving her," she said. "I'm worried about what it will do to her if this doesn't work." Ethan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "What do you mean?" Claire looked toward the hallway that led to the rest of the house. then lowered her voice. If we even consider this, and then the court says no, or Maria changes her mind, or someone decides it's inappropriate, or her throat tightened, Annie will think she wasn't chosen. She'll think she wasn't good enough. Ethan sat very still. He had spent years grieving children he never held. But the idea of harming a child who was already alive, already looking at them with that cautious bravery, terrified him in a way he hadn't expected. Claire's voice softened. And what if I can't be what she needs? What if I'm too broken? Ethan reached across the counter and covered her hand. Claire, you are not broken. She gave a small, bitter laugh. Ethan, my body. He stopped her gently. Your body has been through hell. That's not the same as being broken. Claire stared at his hand on hers, as if she was deciding whether to accept the kindness. I used to picture it, she whispered. A little voice in the hallway, tiny feet, a backpack by the door. Her eyes lifted to his. I pictured someone calling you, Dad. Ethan's throat tightened again. He didn't look away. Claire nodded slowly, as if confirming something inside herself. When Annie said it last night, I hated how much I wanted it. Ethan didn't try to deny it. I wanted it too. The kitchen was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then Claire said, almost in a single breath, Do you think Maria would ever agree? Ethan hesitated. He saw Maria's face, proud, careful, watchful. The way she held Annie's hand when they crossed the driveway. The way she kept her voice respectful without ever sounding small. I don't know, he admitted. But we owe her honesty. Claire nodded once. Today, she said. Not later. Today. Ethan felt a strange mix of dread and relief. In business, delay was strategy. In life, delay could be cowardice. Okay, he said quietly. Today, at 7 o'clock, Maria arrived through the side entrance, hair tucked beneath a scarf, winter coat still on. She paused when she saw Ethan and Claire waiting in the kitchen instead of rushing off to meetings and errands. Her gaze flicked between them, assessing. Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Whitmore. Maria, Claire said gently, can we talk? Maria's expression didn't change, but something in her posture tightened. Of course, Ethan cleared his throat. About last night, Maria's eyes sharpened. Annie was in the main house. Claire nodded. She was hungry. She came for water. She didn't do anything wrong, Maria's jaw said anyway. She shouldn't have been here. I've told her. Ethan lifted a hand, not to silence, but to slow the rush of guilt that always came first for people like Maria, people who had to protect their jobs as much as their children. She wasn't sneaking, Ethan said. She came to the kitchen. She saw me. Maria's eyes narrowed. Saw you doing what? Ethan felt heat climb his neck. He hated being exposed, hated being anything other than composed. But he had asked for this conversation, and he would not hide behind his money. She heard me, he said. She heard me talking. Claire's voice was soft. She heard us. Over the years, Maria's mouth tightened. Her gaze drifted to the counter, then back to them. She listens. She's perceptive. Ethan nodded once. Last night, she asked me a question. Maria's eyes moved to his face. What question? Ethan swallowed, then said it plainly. She asked if I wanted to adopt a child. The air changed. Maria's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she pulled control back over her expression. She asked that? Claire nodded. Yes. Maria's voice went careful. She's a child. Sometimes children say things they don't understand. Ethan recognized the instinct. To protect Annie by minimizing the risk. To protect herself too. She understood enough, Ethan said quietly. She knew we've tried. She knew the numbers. He glanced at Claire, then back to Maria. She knew about the miscarriages, about the IVF. Maria's face hardened not with anger at Annie, but with distress at what she'd carried alone. She shouldn't know that, Maria whispered. Claire's eyes filled. No, she shouldn't. Maria pressed a hand to her forehead like she was fighting off dizziness. I never told her. Ethan didn't accuse. I'm not blaming anyone. I'm saying she's been living in a house full of silence, and children fill silence with their own meanings. Maria's hand dropped. Her gaze sharpened again. protective. Mr. Whitmore, Annie is not a solution. The words were calm, but steel lived inside them. Ethan nodded slowly. You're right. Claire stepped forward just a little, voice trembling but sincere. Maria, we're not asking because we want to take something from you. We're asking because we care about her. Maria's eyes flashed. Caring is not the same as raising. Ethan held her gaze. Then tell us what raising looks like to you. Maria studied him for a long moment. Then her voice softened. Not much, but enough to show the truth underneath her pride. It looks like stability, she said. It looks like a child who doesn't feel like she has to earn a place in a room. Claire's breath caught. Maria continued. Her words measured. Annie is polite because she's learned politeness keeps people from being angry. She tries to be small because being small keeps her safe. Ethan felt the knot in his stomach tighten. Maria's eyes flicked toward the ceiling, as if she could see Annie sleeping in the quarters above the garage. She loves you both, she said quietly. In her way, she watches you. She worries. Claire's tears spilled then, silent and unchecked. I don't want her to worry, she whispered. Maria looked at Claire, and for the first time, something in her expression softened recognition from one woman to another. You don't know what it feels like, Maria said gently, to be her mother and still not be able to give her everything. Ethan spoke before he could overthink it. Then let us help. Maria's eyes sharpened again. Help is temporary. Claire wiped at her cheeks. Not if it's done right. Maria looked between them. And what is right? To you. Ethan's voice was low, steady. It's not replacing you, he said. It's not pretending money makes a family. It's committing. Legally, publicly, permanently, with you still in her life. Maria's breath caught. An open adoption, she said, the term careful on her tongue. Claire nodded. If that's what you would want, if that's what Annie would need. Maria didn't answer immediately. She stared at the countertop, at the steam rising from the coffee, as if reading a future she didn't trust. Then she said quietly, You're asking for something that can't be undone. Ethan nodded. I know. Maria's voice dropped even lower. And if you change your mind? Claire's face tightened, wounded by the question but understanding it. Ethan answered anyway, because it was the only answer that mattered. Then we would be the kind of people we despise, he said. Maria looked up sharply. Ethan held her gaze, his voice calm but absolute. I won't do that to her. The kitchen fell silent again. Maria's eyes shimmered, but she blinked the emotion away quickly. Pride didn't allow tears here. Finally, she said, I won't decide this without Annie. Claire nodded. Of course. Maria's jaw tightened. And I won't let her think she has to say yes to keep you happy. Ethan's chest tightened with respect. That's fair. Maria exhaled slowly. Then we talked to a lawyer, she said. Not yours alone. Someone neutral. Someone who explains every word. Ethan felt a careful relief. Not victory. Not triumph. Just the first step of something real. Claire whispered, Thank you. Maria lifted her chin. Don't thank me yet, she said quietly. We haven't heard the hardest part. Ethan understood what she meant. The hardest part wasn't paperwork. It wasn't court. It was a 6-year-old child learning what forever meant, without fear that forever could vanish. And Ethan knew, with a clarity that terrified him, that he would have to earn that forever one day at a time. The nursery had not been opened in months. Claire stood outside the door longer than she intended to. Her hand hovered near the brass handle, fingers trembling just slightly, not from weakness, but from memory. Ethan watched her from the hallway. Morning light filtered through the tall windows at the end of the corridor, casting pale gold across the polished floor. The house was awake now, staff moving quietly downstairs. Coffee brewing, distant doors opening and closing, but this hallway remained suspended in a different time. Claire finally turned the handle. The door opened without resistance. Inside, the air was still, clean, untouched. The walls were painted a soft cream with a faint blue undertone Claire had chosen after the second pregnancy. Neutral, she had insisted. Something that would work either way. Something hopeful, without being naive. A crib stood in the corner, assembled but never used. A rocking chair beside it. A bookshelf lined with children's classics, Goodnight Moon, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, Where the Wild Things Are Spines Uncracked. Ethan stepped inside slowly. He remembered the afternoon they had set this room up. Claire had sat cross-legged on the floor, holding tiny socks in her hand, laughing at how impossibly small they were. "We'll blink and they'll be grown," she had said. He had believed her. Claire walked toward the crib now and rested her hand on its rail. "I thought if we kept it ready," she whispered, "it would make it more real." Ethan moved closer but did not touch her yet. "For a while, I couldn't even look at it," she continued. "After the 5th time, I avoided this hallway entirely," he remembered. She had started using the guest bathroom downstairs instead of passing this door. She had rearranged her routine to dodge the quiet accusation of unused space. Ethan reached out then and gently brushed his fingers against the edge of the bookshelf. "Last night," Claire said softly. When Annie said that word, Dad, neither of them spoke it. "I felt something shift," she finished. Ethan nodded slowly. "So did I." Claire turned to face him fully. There were no tears this time, just clarity. "If we do this," she said carefully, "we can't do it halfway." "We won't," he answered. "She can't feel like a guest." "She won't. She can't feel like a charity project." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "She won't." Claire studied his face, measuring conviction. "And if the court says no?" she asked. Ethan didn't hesitate this time. "Then, we don't disappear." Claire inhaled slowly. "I don't want her to think love depends on paperwork," she said. Ethan stepped closer and finally placed his hand over hers on the crib rail. "It doesn't," he said quietly, "but stability does." Claire closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing that truth. Downstairs, they heard faint laughter light, unexpected. "Annie." Claire's eyes opened. "She's here," Claire whispered, almost to herself. Ethan listened. The sound was cautious at first, like someone testing whether joy was allowed. Then, it grew slightly louder. Claire gave a small, fragile smile. "Do you remember," she said, "how loud your sister used to be at Thanksgiving?" Ethan blinked, surprised by the memory. "She'd run through the house like it was a racetrack," Claire continued. "Your mother pretending to scold her." He nodded slowly. "I remember." Claire squeezed his hand. "This house was built for noise, Ethan." He looked around the nursery, the crib, the chair, the waiting. "Then maybe it's time it had some," he said. They stood there together. Not grieving anymore, but not celebrating either. Just acknowledging the weight of the decision forming between them. A knock at the open door startled them both. Annie stood there, hesitant, as though she had wandered too far into sacred ground. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "Mrs. Claire said I could come upstairs." Claire released Ethan's hand and knelt slightly so she was closer to Annie's height. "You don't have to apologize for being in this house," Claire said gently. Annie's gaze drifted past her into the room. Her eyes widened. "Is this?" she began. Claire nodded slowly. "It was supposed to be a baby's room." Annie stepped inside cautiously, as though entering a museum exhibit labeled fragile. She walked to the bookshelf and touched one of the books, running her fingers over the raised letters. "Why didn't the baby come?" she asked quietly. The question was direct but not cruel. Claire looked at Ethan briefly before answering. "Sometimes," Claire said softly, "life doesn't work the way we plan." Annie considered that. She moved toward the rocking chair and placed her hand on its armrest. "It's pretty," she said. Ethan watched her take in the room, not with entitlement, not with assumption, just curiosity. He saw something else, too, caution, as if she feared loving this space before knowing whether she was allowed to. Claire stood and walked to the closet, opening it slowly. Inside were neatly folded blankets, untouched, stuffed animals, and a small cardboard box on the top shelf. Claire reached up and brought the box down. Ethan recognized it immediately. Ultrasound photos, hospital bracelets, a tiny knitted hat that had once felt like a promise. Claire opened the lid, then paused. She looked at Annie. "Some of these belong to babies who didn't get to stay," she said gently. Annie's face softened. "Like when someone visits but doesn't move in?" she asked. Claire smiled faintly through the ache. "Something like that." Annie thought for a moment. "Maybe," she said carefully. This room was just waiting for someone who was already here. The simplicity of it stole the air from Ethan's lungs. Claire closed the box slowly and set it aside. She walked toward Annie and crouched again, meeting her eyes. "If we asked you something important," Claire said carefully, "would you promise to answer honestly?" Annie nodded immediately. "Yes, ma'am." Claire hesitated at the formality but let it pass for now. "If," Claire began, then corrected herself. "If nothing changed tomorrow, if this house stayed exactly the way it is, would you still feel safe here?" Annie looked around the room again, then back at Claire. "Yes," she said softly. Ethan felt something settle inside him, not certainty, not yet, but direction. Claire glanced at him. He understood the look. This wasn't about rescuing anyone. It was about choosing. Ethan stepped forward and knelt beside Claire. "Annie," he said gently, "there are some big conversations happening. They're not decisions yet, just conversations." Annie nodded, serious. "But whatever happens," he continued, "you don't have to earn a place here." Annie's brows furrowed slightly. "I don't?" "No," Claire said firmly. "You don't." Annie looked between them, absorbing the words carefully, as though testing whether they might disappear. Then she did something small but profound. She walked over to the crib and touched it lightly. "Can I sit in the rocking chair?" she asked. Claire glanced at Ethan, and for the first time in years, the answer didn't carry fear. "Yes," Claire said softly. "You can." Annie climbed carefully into the chair and began rocking gently, her small feet barely reaching the floor. The motion filled the room with the faint creak of wood, a sound the space had never known. Ethan watched the chair move back and forth, back and forth. The room that had once held silence like a wound now held movement, and as the morning light grew stronger across the nursery floor, Ethan understood something quietly, but completely. Some rooms wait for children who are born into them. Others wait for children brave enough to knock. Maria stood at the ironing board in the staff quarters above the garage, pressing one of Ethan's white dress shirts with steady, practiced movements. The small apartment smelled faintly of starch and lavender detergent. The window over the sink looked out toward the back lawn, where frost still clung to the grass in pale silver patches. Annie sat at the tiny kitchen table with a coloring book open in front of her, though she hadn't turned a page in several minutes. "Mom?" Annie asked quietly. Maria didn't look up. Are you mad?" The iron paused mid-glide. Maria set it upright carefully before answering. "Why would I be mad?" Annie traced the outline of a flower with her finger instead of the crayon. "Because I asked Mr. Whitmore something big." Maria turned slowly. There it was. The conversation she had both expected and feared. "What did you ask him?" Maria said evenly, though she already knew. Annie's voice grew small but steady. "If he wanted to adopt a child." Maria's jaw tightened despite herself. Not at Annie, never at Annie, but at the weight of the word adopt. She crossed the small room and sat opposite her daughter. "Why would you ask that?" Maria asked gently. Annie hesitated. "Because he's always sad at night." Maria inhaled slowly. "He sits in the big chair," Annie continued. "And he says he's sorry. He says after 5 times and 2 science tries, he still couldn't give Mrs. Claire a baby." Maria closed her eyes briefly. "Children should not be counting miscarriages." "They didn't tell you that," Maria said. "I heard," Annie replied simply. Maria studied her daughter's face, the seriousness that didn't belong on a 6-year-old. "And what made you think you should fix that?" Maria asked softly. Annie blinked. "I wasn't fixing it." Maria leaned forward. "Then what were you doing?" Annie looked down at her hands. "I just thought, maybe if I'm already here, it would be easier." Maria's chest tightened. Easier, as if a child's existence could be measured in convenience. "Annie," Maria said carefully, choosing every word, "you are not something to make someone else feel better." Annie's head snapped up. "I know." "Do you?" Maria asked, voice gentle but firm. Annie nodded slowly. "I know." But he looked like he needed someone. Maria felt her defenses falter. She had worked in the Whitmore household long enough to see the grief in quiet ways, the unopened nursery, the way Claire lingered in the children's section of bookstores, the nights Ethan stayed downstairs long after everyone else slept. Maria stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mansion rising beyond the lawn. It was beautiful, imposing, built of stone and ambition, but she had seen the emptiness inside it too. "You cannot give yourself away because you think someone is lonely," Maria said quietly, still facing the glass. "I wasn't giving myself away. Annie said. Maria turned. What were you doing then? Annie hesitated, then answered with surprising clarity. I was asking if they wanted me. The words struck Maria harder than she expected. She walked back to the table and knelt in front of her daughter, placing both hands on Annie's shoulders. Listen to me, Maria said softly but firmly. You are wanted. By me. Annie's eyes filled slightly but did not spill over. I know, she whispered. Maria searched her face. You don't need a big house to be important, Maria continued. You don't need their last name to be safe. Annie hesitated. But if I had both, would that be bad? Maria exhaled slowly. There it was. The question beneath the question. Maria had grown up with nothing but hand-me-downs and pride. She had scrubbed floors for families who never learned her birthday. She had promised herself that Annie would never feel small because of where she came from. Yet here they were. A chance that could change everything. Or break it. Did they say anything? Maria asked carefully. Annie nodded. They said we're going to talk. Maria closed her eyes briefly. Of course they were. Later that afternoon, Maria entered the main house through the side door as she always did, apron folded neatly over her arm. The scent of roasted chicken and thyme lingered from lunch preparations. The space felt different today, quieter in a way that wasn't heavy. Claire stood near the kitchen island, hands clasped. Maria, she said softly, do you have a minute? Maria placed the apron down and met her gaze evenly. I always have a minute for you. Ethan joined them from the hallway, jacket off, sleeves rolled. Not the CEO. Not the man on magazine covers. Just Ethan. We've been thinking, Claire began. Maria's posture straightened subtly, pride rising to full height. We don't want to pressure you, Ethan said quickly. Or Annie. Maria held up a hand. Before you say anything else, I need to say something. They fell silent. Annie is not a blessing you get because you suffered, Maria said calmly. She is not compensation for miscarriages. She is not a solution to grief. Claire's eyes glistened, but she nodded. We know, Maria continued, voice steady. If you ever make her feel like she owes you happiness, I will walk out of this house with her and never look back. Ethan did not flinch. You're right, he said simply. Maria studied him for signs of offense. There were none. Claire stepped closer. We don't want to replace you, she said. We don't want to erase where she comes from. Maria's chin lifted. She comes from me. Yes, Claire said softly. And that would never change. Silence stretched between them, not hostile, but charged with history. Ethan spoke carefully. If we do this, it would be open, transparent, legal, with your consent at every step. Maria watched him, searching for weakness. You would still be her mother, Claire added. Always. Maria swallowed. And if the court says no? She asked. Then nothing changes, Ethan replied. Except that she knows she is loved by more than one household. Maria's breath wavered. She thought of Annie sleeping under a thin quilt some winters, thought of tuition bills, thought of college, thought of a room upstairs in the mansion that had been waiting for a child who never came. Do you love her? Maria asked bluntly. Claire answered without hesitation. Yes. Ethan didn't add flourish. I do. Maria studied their faces long enough to recognize the difference between pity and commitment. Finally, she nodded once. We speak to a lawyer, she said. A good one, not someone who rushes. Ethan nodded immediately. Agreed. And Annie decides with us, Maria added. Claire's voice was steady now. Of course. Maria picked up her apron again, tying it around her waist. Then we move slowly, she said. Because forever should never be rushed. Ethan felt the truth of that settle deep. Annie's laughter drifted faintly from the backyard, where she was chasing fallen leaves across the lawn. Maria glanced toward the sound. She doesn't know what forever costs yet, Maria said quietly. Ethan looked toward the window too. I do, he replied. And for the first time, the cost didn't frighten him. The following Monday, the sky over Hartford was the color of brushed steel. Ethan drove. He could have sent a driver. He could have arranged a private meeting in his office overlooking Manhattan. But this conversation did not belong in a boardroom. It did not belong in a place where his name opened doors before he even knocked. Claire sat beside him in the passenger seat, hands folded neatly in her lap. Maria and Annie were in the back. Annie had insisted on wearing her best cardigan, the pale blue one with tiny pearl buttons, though no one had told her this was a special occasion. To her, it was just a talk. To the adults, it was a line in the sand. They pulled into a modest brick building near Bushnell Park. A brass plaque near the entrance read, Evelyn Carter, family law attorney. No relation to Ethan. He had chosen her precisely because she had never represented him before. Inside, the office smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Framed degrees lined the walls, alongside photographs of families, weddings, adoptions, newborns swaddled in hospital blankets. Evelyn Carter was in her late 50s, silver hair pulled into a neat twist at the nape of her neck. Her handshake was firm, unhurried. Mr. Whitmore, she said evenly. Mrs. Whitmore. Miss Hernandez. Maria's back straightened at the use of her last name. And this must be Annie. Annie nodded politely. Yes, ma'am. Evelyn smiled. You can call me Miss Carter. They settled into a small conference room with a round oak table, no hierarchy of seating. No head of the table. Ethan noticed that immediately. That's intentional, Evelyn said, catching his glance. No one sits at the head when we're talking about children. He gave a small nod of respect. Evelyn folded her hands. I understand we're discussing a potential open adoption. Maria's jaw tightened slightly, but she didn't look away. Yes, Ethan said calmly. Potential. Evelyn turned to Maria. And you are Annie's sole legal guardian? Yes, Maria answered firmly. No outstanding custody claims? No paternal rights to terminate? Maria shook her head. Her father left before she was born. There are no claims. Evelyn nodded, jotting notes. Claire spoke next, voice steady but careful. We want Annie to feel secure, not temporary. Evelyn's eyes softened slightly. Security is built in two ways, legally and emotionally. We can address the first. The second is yours to earn. Silence settled over the table. Evelyn turned to Annie. Do you know why you're here today? Annie swung her feet lightly beneath the chair but met the attorney's eyes. We're talking about if I can stay forever. Maria inhaled sharply. Evelyn nodded gently. And how do you feel about that? Annie hesitated. Ethan felt his muscles tense, wanting to protect her from answering too quickly. I like both houses, Annie said carefully. But I don't like not knowing. Evelyn leaned back slightly. Not knowing what, if I'm visiting? Annie replied. The words were simple, but they landed with adult weight. Evelyn glanced around the table before speaking again. Open adoption means Annie would legally become Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore's daughter, but her relationship with you, Maria, would remain active and recognized. There would be written agreements about visits, holidays, decisions. Maria's voice was steady but quiet. And if they changed their minds? Evelyn didn't soften her answer. Once finalized, adoption is permanent. They cannot return her. Ethan's jaw tightened at the phrasing, but he understood the necessity. Maria continued. And if I change mine? Evelyn's tone remained factual. Before finalization, you may withdraw consent. Afterward, you cannot. Maria absorbed that silently. Claire spoke. We're not here to rush you. Maria looked at her. But you are here to move forward. Claire didn't deny it. Yes. Evelyn folded her hands again. There is also a home study process, interviews, background checks, counseling recommendations. Ethan nodded. We'll comply with everything. Evelyn looked directly at him, including financial transparency beyond what you're comfortable sharing. He didn't hesitate. Yes. Maria watched him carefully. Evelyn turned back to Annie. And you, young lady, if at any point you feel unsure, you can say so. Annie frowned slightly. Will that make people sad? The room went still. Evelyn's voice softened. It might make people thoughtful. But no one here wants you to answer just to keep them happy. Annie glanced at Maria. Maria nodded slowly. You speak your truth, mija. Annie looked at Claire and Ethan. I want to stay, she said softly. But I don't want my mom to disappear. Claire's hand moved instinctively toward Annie's but stopped just short of touching her. She won't, Claire said gently. Maria blinked back emotion she refused to show fully. Evelyn closed her folder. Then the next step is a preliminary filing and a 60-day review period. Ethan nodded. Maria inhaled deeply. 60 days. It allows everyone to think. Evelyn said, "to test the reality of what forever feels like." Outside, a siren wailed faintly down the street, then faded. Annie leaned toward Maria. "Is 60 days long?" Maria smiled faintly. "It's about 2 months." Annie nodded as if calculating something important. Ethan looked around the table at Claire's restrained hope, at Maria's guarded strength, at Annie's cautious bravery. Forever, he realized, wasn't a single decision. It was a series of smaller ones made correctly. As they stood to leave, Evelyn added one final note. "Mr. Whitmore." He turned. "Adoption doesn't erase grief," she said calmly. "It adds responsibility." He met her gaze evenly. "I understand." She held his eyes a moment longer, measuring him. "I hope you do." Outside, the cold air felt sharper. Annie reached for Maria's hand first. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she reached for Ethan's too. He felt her small fingers curl around his. Not testing this time, just holding. 60 days. He had negotiated billion-dollar timelines shorter than that, yet nothing had ever felt longer. The word temporary settled into the Whitmore household like an uninvited guest. It wasn't spoken often, but everyone felt it. The 60-day review period began quietly. Papers were filed, interviews scheduled, background checks requested. The machinery of the legal system moved forward with methodical calm, indifferent to how much was at stake inside a 6-year-old heart. Annie, however, measured time differently. On the first morning after the lawyers' meeting, she woke up in the staff apartment above the garage and stared at the ceiling for several long seconds before sitting up. "Is today one of the 60? She asked Maria over oatmeal. Maria paused, spoon hovering midair. "Yes." Annie nodded, solemn. "Then we should count," she said. So they did. A small calendar went up on the refrigerator. Annie drew a tiny blue star on the square for that day. Day 1. Across the lawn in the main house, Ethan stood in the kitchen reviewing emails on his tablet, while Claire stirred a pot of oatmeal on the stove. Real oatmeal, not instant. She had insisted. "She likes cinnamon," Claire murmured, almost to herself. Ethan looked up. "You're making enough for 4? Claire nodded. It was subtle, but deliberate. At 7:30, Maria knocked lightly on the side door as usual. Only this time, Annie wasn't carrying her backpack for school. She was carrying a small overnight bag. Maria stepped inside first, composed but tight around the eyes. "Just for a few nights. Temporary." Ethan crouched to Annie's level. "You packed everything you need?" Annie nodded. "Mom said I can come back any time." "That's right," Maria confirmed quickly. Claire stepped forward and knelt as well. "Your room is ready." Annie hesitated at the word. Room. Not guest room. Not nursery. Just room. Ethan carried the overnight bag upstairs, walking slower than necessary. Annie followed Claire, her small hand wrapped in Claire's fingers. When they reached the nursery door, Claire paused. "We thought," she said gently, "you might want to help change it a little." Annie looked confused. "Make it yours," Claire clarified. Inside, the crib was gone. In its place stood a small twin bed with a white quilt and a pale blue throw at the foot. The rocking chair remained. The bookshelf remained. But the room felt less like a shrine and more like possibility. Annie stepped inside cautiously. "You took the baby bed away," she said. Ethan nodded. "It didn't belong there anymore." Annie walked to the bed and pressed her palm into the mattress, testing it. "It's soft," she whispered. Claire watched her carefully. "You can choose new sheets if you'd like." Annie's eyes widened slightly. "I can?" "Yes," Claire said. "Your choice." Annie considered that as though it were a complicated privilege. Downstairs, Maria lingered in the entryway, hands clasped. Ethan came back down and found her standing alone. "She'll be okay," he said quietly. Maria's gaze lifted. "I didn't ask if she would be okay." He held her eyes. "I'm asking if she'll be safe," Maria continued. Ethan didn't rush his answer. "Yes." Maria searched his face for arrogance, for overconfidence. She found none. "She still needs rules," Maria said. "Bedtime, homework, chores." Ethan gave a small nod. "Good. So do we." A faint smile flickered across Maria's face before disappearing. Upstairs, Annie was opening drawers, discovering space that belonged to no one else. Claire stood near the window, watching. "You can leave some things at your mom's," Claire said gently. You don't have to move everything at once. Annie nodded. Will I get in trouble if I forget something there? She asked. Claire's heart twisted. No, she said softly. You won't. That night, the house felt different. At dinner, Annie sat between Ethan and Claire, posture straight, napkin in her lap. She waited before taking a bite until Claire nodded approval. Ethan noticed. You don't have to wait for permission to eat, he said gently. Annie froze slightly. Mom says it's polite. It is, Claire agreed. But you're family at this table. The word family landed gently, not forced. Annie resumed eating, but slower, thoughtful. After dinner, Ethan helped Annie with her reading homework. She sounded out words carefully, glancing up to make sure she was getting them right. You can try again if you miss one, he told her. She nodded, concentrating harder. When it was time for bed, Claire tucked the quilt around Annie's shoulders. Ethan stood awkwardly near the doorway, unsure of the protocol. Do you want the light on? Claire asked. Annie hesitated. Just a little. Claire turned on the small lamp beside the bed. Ethan cleared his throat. We're down the hall, he said. If you need anything. Annie nodded. He lingered a moment longer, then stepped into the hallway with Claire. They stood outside the door, listening. Inside, there was no crying, no protest, just the faint rustle of sheets. Claire exhaled slowly. It feels real. Ethan nodded. Too real? She asked. He thought about that. No, he said. Just earned. They went to bed unsure whether sleep would come easily. It didn't. Around 2 a.m, Ethan woke to the sound of soft footsteps. He sat up instantly. A small shadow stood in the doorway. Annie, he whispered. She walked toward the bed slowly. I couldn't tell if I was still here, she admitted. Claire sat up too, her voice thick with sleep. What do you mean? Annie looked down at her feet. Sometimes when I wake up somewhere new, I think maybe it was a dream. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and crouched in front of her. This isn't a dream, he said gently. Annie studied his face carefully, as though verifying truth. Can I check? She asked. Ethan blinked. Check what? She reached out and touched his arm, then Claire's hand. Then she nodded slightly. Okay, she said. Ethan didn't ask what that meant. Do you want to sleep here tonight? Claire asked softly. Annie hesitated, then shook her head. No, I'll go back. She turned and padded down the hallway alone. Ethan and Claire listened as her bedroom door clicked shut. Claire lay back slowly. She's testing the walls, she whispered. Ethan stared at the ceiling. No, he said quietly. She's testing us. Day 2 would come in the morning. And temporary, he realized, was not about time. It was about trust. Day 5. 5 small blue stars marked the calendar in the staff apartment. Annie had insisted on drawing each one herself before school. Even though she was now sleeping in the main house, she still went upstairs to Maria's kitchen every morning before class. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. Ethan noticed. He watched from the kitchen window as Annie crossed the lawn with her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders. Frost still clung to the edges of the grass. Maria would be waiting with her coat on, coffee mug in hand, pretending not to count the seconds. Temporary had changed the rhythm of the house. It had not changed Annie's loyalty. That evening, after homework and dinner, Claire sat beside Annie at the dining table with a stack of school forms. Emergency contact, Claire read aloud gently. We'll need to update this if the adoption moves forward. Annie traced the edge of the paper with her finger. Does that mean I don't put Mom anymore? She asked. Claire's heart squeezed. No, she said carefully. It means you might have more than one. Annie nodded slowly. Ethan, sitting across the table, studied her expression. She didn't look confused. She looked cautious. Later that night, Ethan found Annie sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, coloring carefully inside the lines of a picture she had brought from the staff apartment. He sat down opposite her. What are you drawing? He asked. My family, she replied without looking up. He watched as she shaded 3 figures in soft brown, peach, and tan. Maria stood on the left, Claire on the right, Annie in the middle. Ethan hesitated. Where am I? He asked gently. Annie paused. Then she picked up a different crayon. She drew him slightly behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. Why behind? he asked softly. Annie shrugged. So you can't leave first. The innocence of it pierced deeper than accusation ever could. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached forward and added something small, a sun in the corner of the page. Annie watched him. You don't have to stand back there, he said quietly. I'm not planning on leaving. She didn't argue, but she didn't move him either. That night at bedtime, Claire tucked Annie in as usual. Good night, Claire said softly. Annie hesitated. Good night, ma'am. Claire froze slightly, though her expression didn't harden. You don't have to call me ma'am, she said gently. Annie looked uncertain. That's respectful. It is, Claire agreed. But respect doesn't require distance. Annie stared at the quilt. What should I say then? Claire swallowed. You can call me Claire, she offered carefully. Annie's face tightened slightly. That feels wrong, she whispered. Claire nodded slowly. Then we'll take our time. She turned off the lamp and left the door slightly open. In the hallway, she found Ethan waiting. She still won't say it, Claire murmured. Ethan nodded. It's only day 5. Claire leaned against the wall. She calls you Dad. Ethan exhaled slowly. She tested it, he said. Once. Claire studied him. And? His voice dropped lower. I didn't stop her. Claire's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. She won't call me Mom, she said quietly. Ethan stepped closer. Maybe she's protecting you. Claire frowned slightly. From what? From losing it again, he answered. The thought settled heavily between them. Inside her room, Annie lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She whispered the words softly into the dark. Mom. It felt big. Too big. She tried again. Mom. The sound made her chest ache in a way she didn't understand. She rolled onto her side and hugged her pillow instead. Downstairs, Ethan poured himself a glass of water instead of bourbon. He stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the faint glow from the staff apartment. He wondered if Maria was awake too. He suspected she was. Temporary was hardest at night. The next afternoon, a social worker named Mr. Douglas arrived for the preliminary home study. He was middle-aged, neatly dressed, with kind but observant eyes. He spoke to Ethan and Claire in the study, first asking about discipline, about education plans, about expectations. Then he requested to speak with Annie alone. Maria was present but seated quietly in the corner. Mr. Douglas smiled gently. Annie, do you feel safe in this house? Annie nodded. Do you feel safe with Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore? Another nod. Do you feel safe with your mom? Annie looked at Maria immediately. Yes. Mr. Douglas smiled slightly. Good. He leaned forward gently. If the adoption happens, what are you most excited about? Annie thought carefully. Not packing a bag, she said. The adults in the room went very still. Mr. Douglas didn't react visibly, but his pen paused. And what are you most worried about? He asked gently. Annie looked at her hands. That if I say the wrong thing, it goes away. Maria inhaled sharply. Ethan felt the truth of that sentence hit him square in the chest. After the interview, Mr. Douglas left with polite reassurances and a clipboard full of notes. The door closed behind him. Silence filled the foyer. Maria turned to Annie and knelt, cupping her face gently. You never have to say the right thing to keep love, she said firmly. Annie nodded, but her eyes flicked toward Ethan. He crouched in front of her too. You could say you hate broccoli, he said lightly, and I'd still be here. A faint smile tugged at her mouth. Claire knelt beside them. This isn't a test, Claire added softly. We're not grading you. Annie looked between all 3 adults. Then why does it feel like one? She asked. No one answered immediately, because the truth was, it was a test, not of Annie, but of them. That night, as Claire turned off the hallway lights, she paused outside Annie's room. Good night, she called softly. There was a pause. Then, from inside the dim room, good night, Claire. It was small, careful, but it was progress. Claire closed her eyes briefly, letting that single word settle like something sacred. Downstairs, Ethan crossed another day off the calendar. Day 5, 55 to go. Temporary was still written all over their lives, but the spaces between the letters were beginning to close. By day 12, the house had settled into a rhythm that almost felt ordinary. Almost. Annie's shoes now lined the entryway beside Ethan's polished Oxfords and Claire's low-heeled boots. A pink toothbrush stood in the upstairs bathroom. A small backpack rested against the wall near the kitchen door each afternoon. Small evidence, proof that temporary was beginning to leave fingerprints. Ethan returned from New York earlier than usual that Thursday. His driver had dropped him at the train station in Westport that morning, but he had insisted on driving himself home that evening. He needed the quiet. The meeting in Manhattan had not gone the way he expected, not financially. Socially, they had been seated at a private dining room in Midtown, 3 investors, 1 board member, and a man Ethan had known since business school. Steak, red wine, soft jazz in the background. The conversation had shifted casually. "I hear you're adopting," one of the investors had said, swirling his glass. Ethan had nodded once. "We're in the process." A small smile passed between 2 of them. "That's generous," another had remarked. The word lingered too long. Generous, as though Annie were a tax deduction, as though love were philanthropy. "It's not charity," Ethan had said calmly. His old classmate leaned back in his chair. "No, of course not. But you understand optics. Your housekeeper's child?" Ethan had felt something tighten in his chest. "Yes," he had answered evenly. "I understand optics." The board member had chuckled lightly. "Well, as long as you're prepared for the press angle." Ethan had set his fork down. "Prepared for what angle?" The man shrugged. "White billionaire adopts black employee's daughter. It'll trend for a week. You'll be a hero. Or a villain. Depends who writes it." The table had gone quiet. Ethan's voice remained controlled. "This isn't a campaign. Everything is," the board member replied. Ethan had ended the dinner shortly after. Now, as he pulled into the long driveway of his Connecticut home, those words echoed louder than the engine. Optics, hero, villain. He parked and sat in the driver's seat for a full minute before stepping out. Through the front window, he could see Annie sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, building something out of wooden blocks. Claire sat nearby with a book open in her lap, though she wasn't reading. She was watching. The sight slowed his breathing. Inside, Annie looked up as the door opened. "You're home," she said, surprise bright in her voice. Ethan smiled despite himself. "I live here." Annie tilted her head slightly. "But sometimes you don't." The statement wasn't accusatory, just observational. He loosened his tie. "That's fair." Claire rose and kissed his cheek lightly. "How was the city?" He hesitated. "Educational," he said. Claire's eyes searched his face. Later that night, after Annie was upstairs brushing her teeth, Ethan poured 2 cups of tea instead of wine and sat across from Claire at the kitchen table. "They're talking," he said quietly. Claire didn't ask who. "About what?" she replied softly. "About us. About Annie." He exhaled slowly. "About how it looks." Claire's jaw tightened. "Looks? White billionaire adopts black housekeeper's child." He said the words plainly. "They think it's a headline." Claire's face paled slightly, but her voice stayed steady. "And what do you think?" Ethan leaned back in his chair. "I think I don't care what they write," he said carefully. "But I care what Annie feels." Claire nodded slowly. "She already feels small sometimes," Claire whispered. "I won't let her feel displayed." Ethan ran a hand over his face. "They'll question our motives." "They already question everything," Claire replied. He met her eyes. "I won't have her growing up wondering if she was chosen for publicity." Claire's voice sharpened slightly. "Then we don't make this public." Ethan hesitated. "We can't hide an adoption." "No," Claire agreed. "But we can refuse to perform it." Silence settled between them. Ethan finally nodded. "No interviews, no statements." Claire reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "No narrative except the one inside this house." Upstairs, Annie stood at the bathroom sink, staring at herself in the mirror. She touched her braids thoughtfully. At school that day, one of the girls had asked, "Do you live in that big house now?" Annie had shrugged. "Are they your real parents?" The girl had pressed. Annie hadn't known how to answer. Real. The word had followed her home. She padded down the hallway and stopped outside Ethan's study door. He was inside, reviewing documents. She knocked softly. "Come in," he called. She stepped inside, small against the wall of books and framed awards. "Can I ask something?" she said. He closed his laptop immediately. "Always." Annie walked closer to his desk. "At school," she began, twisting her fingers together. "They asked if you're my real dad." Ethan felt the air shift. "And what did you say?" he asked gently. I said, I don't know yet. He nodded slowly. That's honest. Annie frowned slightly. What does real mean? Ethan leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. Some people think real means who you're born to, he said. Other people think real means who stays. Annie considered that. Which one are you? She asked. He stood and walked around the desk, crouching so he was eye level with her. I'm trying to be the one who stays, he said quietly. Annie searched his face carefully. And if people talk about it? She asked. He didn't pretend not to understand. People always talk, he said calmly. But they don't get to decide what we are. Annie nodded slowly. She hesitated, then reached for his hand again. Not testing, not uncertain, just grounding herself. Okay, she said softly. Ethan felt the weight of that word more than any boardroom vote. Downstairs, Claire stood in the hallway, listening without meaning to. When Annie came back out of the study, Claire knelt and hugged her gently. You don't have to answer anyone at school, Claire said softly. You can say, it's my family, and that's enough. Annie nodded. Later that night, as Ethan crossed off day 12 on the calendar, he paused. Optics, headlines, press, they all seemed smaller now. Upstairs, a 6-year-old girl slept with the door slightly open, and for the first time, Ethan understood something clearly. Money could buy silence. It could buy privacy. It could buy influence, but it could never buy legitimacy in the eyes of a child. That had to be earned. One night, one answer, one promise at a time. Day 21 arrived with a sky that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. By late afternoon, the air had turned heavy and metallic, pressing down on the Connecticut hills like something waiting to break. The wind picked up first, sharp, restless, bending the bare branches beyond the Whitmore estate. Annie stood at the tall living room window, watching the trees sway. Is it going to rain? She asked. Ethan glanced up from his laptop. Looks like it. Claire was in the kitchen finishing dinner, though no one was particularly hungry. Storms had a way of unsettling more than the sky. The first crack of thunder came just before 7. It split the air with sudden violence, rattling the glass panes and setting off a car alarm somewhere in the distance. Annie flinched. Claire hurried into the living room. It's just thunder, sweetheart. Annie nodded quickly, too quickly. The rain followed hard, relentless. Sheets of water streaked across the windows, blurring the outside world into gray chaos. Another boom shook the house. This time Annie's shoulders tightened visibly. Ethan closed his laptop. Do you want to watch a movie upstairs? Claire suggested gently. Annie hesitated. Can I stay here? Of course, Ethan said. They dimmed the lights and sat together on the couch. Annie curled into the corner, knees tucked close to her chest, pretending she wasn't counting the seconds between lightning and thunder. Ethan noticed. He remembered something from his own childhood summers in Boston. Thunderstorms rolling over the harbor. His mother counting aloud to measure how far away the storm was. 1001, he said softly after a flash lit up the room. Annie looked at him. 1002. Thunder crashed. That means it's close, she whispered. He nodded. But it's moving. Another flash. 1001. She joined him this time. 1002. The thunder came a little later. See, he said gently. It's traveling. Annie relaxed a fraction. But when the lights flickered once, twice, she stiffened again. The house plunged briefly into darkness before the generator kicked in with a low hum. Annie grabbed the edge of the couch instinctively. It's okay, Claire said softly, though her own pulse had quickened. Another crash of thunder, louder than the last. And then, the unmistakable sound of something falling outside, a heavy branch hitting the ground. Annie bolted upright. I don't like it, she whispered. Ethan stood immediately. It's just a tree limb. But Annie was already backing away from the windows. I don't like when things break, she said, voice trembling now. Claire moved toward her slowly. Nothing inside is broken. Lightning flashed again, filling the room with white light. And then Annie did something neither of them expected. She ran, not upstairs, not toward the staff quarters. She ran straight down the hallway toward Ethan and Claire's bedroom. Ethan followed immediately. He found her standing beside the bed, breathing fast, eyes wide. Another thunderclap rattled the roof, and then she asked it. The question that had been building for 21 days. If I call you Dad, will you still want me? The storm seemed to pause inside him. He knelt in front of her. the echo of thunder fading behind the pounding of his own heart. "Why would you ask that?" he said gently. Her voice shook. "Because storms make things fall, and if something falls wrong, maybe people change their minds." Claire inhaled sharply behind him. Annie's small hands clenched into fists. "What if the court says no?" She rushed out. "What if someone decides I don't fit here? What if you wake up and don't want this anymore?" The words spilled out like the rain against the glass. Ethan felt the weight of every adult conversation she had overheard. Optics, papers, 60 days, temporary. He reached forward slowly and took her hands in his. "Look at me," he said softly. She did. "Storms don't decide families," he continued. "Judges don't decide love. They decide paperwork." Another boom shook the walls. Annie flinched but didn't pull away. "I won't wake up and not want you," Ethan said firmly. "That's not how this works." Her eyes searched his face. "Even if it's hard," she whispered. "Especially if it's hard." Claire stepped closer and knelt beside them. "We've had storms before," she said quietly. 5 times. 7. If you count everything. Annie nodded, remembering. "And we're still here," Claire finished. Annie's breathing began to slow. Outside, the thunder rolled again, but softer this time. More distant. Ethan felt something shift inside him, not fear, not doubt, resolve. He pulled Annie gently into his arms. She didn't hesitate this time. She wrapped her arms around his neck and held on. "Dad," she whispered. The word didn't feel like a test anymore. It felt like a claim. Ethan closed his eyes and held her tighter. "Yes," he answered. Claire's hand rested on Annie's back, steady and sure. The storm moved gradually east, its violence fading into low rumbles and steady rain. Inside the bedroom, the air felt different, quieter, softer. After several minutes, Annie pulled back slightly. "Can I stay here tonight?" she asked. Claire smiled softly. "Yes." They made space in the bed, Annie tucked between them, small and warm and breathing evenly as exhaustion finally claimed her. Ethan stared at the ceiling long after the thunder had faded completely. He understood now that Annie wasn't afraid of lightning. She was afraid of disappearance, and in that moment, with her small hand resting against his chest, he made a promise he didn't speak out loud. No storm, no headline, no court ruling would ever make him step back from this child again. In the quiet that followed, the house no longer felt temporary. It felt claimed. The morning after the storm, the sky was startlingly clear. Sunlight poured through the tall windows as if the night before had been a rumor. The fallen branch lay across the edge of the lawn, harmless now, already reduced to something manageable. Inside the Whitmore house, Annie was still asleep between Ethan and Claire. Ethan woke first. He didn't move immediately. Annie's hand rested flat against his chest, rising and falling with his breath. Claire's fingers were curled lightly around Annie's shoulder, even in sleep protective, instinctive. For years, Ethan had woken in this bed with silence pressing against him like weight. Now, there was warmth and responsibility. He carefully slipped out of bed without waking either of them and went downstairs. He brewed coffee himself, the steady rhythm of measuring grounds and pouring water calming his thoughts. On the kitchen counter sat a neat stack of documents Evelyn Carter had emailed the night before. Preliminary consent forms, financial disclosure requirements, home study schedule, psychological evaluation appointments. The language was clinical, precise, unemotional. Ethan flipped open the first folder. Claire joined him minutes later, still wearing the robe she had thrown on in the hallway the night before. She didn't speak right away. She simply placed her hand over the stack of papers. "So this is what forever looks like," she murmured. Ethan gave a small nod. In legal terms, Claire scanned the first page. "Termination of parental rights," she read softly. Her voice faltered. "Maria." The words were stark, almost violent on paper. "She doesn't lose her," Ethan said quietly. "Not in an open adoption." Claire nodded, but her eyes were troubled. "It still sounds like losing." Upstairs, a small door creaked open. Annie's footsteps padded down the hallway. She appeared at the edge of the kitchen, hair slightly tangled, still wrapped in one of Claire's oversized t-shirts she had slept in after the storm. "Is it morning?" she asked. Ethan smiled faintly. "It is." Annie walked over and climbed onto the stool beside Claire. "What are those?" she asked, pointing at the papers. "Just grown-up paperwork," Claire replied gently. Annie frowned slightly. "Is it about me?" Ethan didn't lie. Yes. Annie nodded once. Does it say I have to be perfect? The question hit harder than either of them expected. No, Claire said firmly. Ethan leaned closer. It says we have to be responsible. Annie considered that. Are you good at that? She asked him. He almost laughed. In business, he said. Very. Annie tilted her head. And at being a dad? The word didn't shake him this time. I'm learning, he said honestly. Annie nodded, satisfied with that answer. Later that afternoon, Maria joined them in the sitting room for the first official consent discussion with Evelyn on speakerphone. Evelyn's voice came through clear and steady. Maria, before we proceed further, you need to understand that once the adoption is finalized, Annie will legally become a Whitmore. That includes inheritance rights, decision-making authority, medical guardianship. Maria listened without interrupting. And you, Evelyn continued, will no longer be her sole legal guardian. The silence that followed was thick. Maria's gaze never left Annie, who sat beside Claire on the couch. I will still be her mother, Maria said quietly. Yes, Evelyn answered. Emotionally, practically, by agreement. But legally, her parents will be Ethan and Claire. Maria nodded once. I need it in writing, she said firmly. Visits, holidays, school events, everything. You will have it, Ethan said. Evelyn cleared her throat gently. This is not about distrust. It is about clarity. Maria's voice sharpened slightly. Clarity protects children. Ethan met her gaze with steady respect. Then we will be clear. Annie looked between the adults. Does this mean I get 2 houses? She asked. Maria managed a faint smile. It means you don't lose either one. Annie nodded, absorbing that. Evelyn's voice softened. Annie, do you feel comfortable continuing this process? Annie hesitated. Ethan resisted the urge to jump in. I do, Annie said finally. But I don't want my mom to feel like I left. Maria's composure cracked for just a second. You are not leaving me, she said firmly, pulling Annie close. You are growing. After the call ended, the room remained quiet. The stack of papers sat heavier than before. Claire reached for a pen. Her hand trembled slightly as she signed her name on the first disclosure form. Ethan followed. His signature, so effortless in billion-dollar contracts, felt different here. Slower, more deliberate. Maria did not sign that day. She took her copies home. I will read every word, she said. You should, Ethan replied. That evening, as Annie prepared for bed, Claire brushed her hair gently in front of the mirror. Does it hurt? Claire asked softly. No, Annie said. Claire's reflection caught Annie's eyes. Are you scared? Claire asked. Annie thought about it. A little, she admitted. But not like before. Claire's hand paused. Before when? She asked gently. Before the storm, Annie replied. Claire felt her throat tighten. Ethan stood in the doorway, listening quietly. When Annie climbed into bed, she didn't ask to check if it was real. She didn't test the walls. She simply pulled the quilt up and said, Good night. Ethan lingered at the door. Good night, he replied. He hesitated, then added softly, I'm proud of you. Annie smiled faintly. For what? For being brave. She thought about that. I think you're being brave too, she said. The simplicity of it humbled him. After she fell asleep, Ethan returned to the kitchen and looked again at the signed pages. Paperwork and promises. One gave structure, the other gave meaning, and he understood now that both were necessary. Day 32. The house no longer felt like it was holding its breath. Annie's drawings covered one side of the refrigerator, crooked suns. Stick figures holding hands, a dog she insisted they would have someday. Her sneakers were no longer lined up perfectly by the door. They were kicked off carelessly, proof that caution was loosening its grip. And yet, beneath the growing comfort, something else was stirring. It began on a Thursday afternoon. Claire had picked Annie up from school because Maria had an early shift. The ride home was quiet, not tense, just thoughtful. Annie stared out the window longer than usual. When they pulled into the driveway, Annie didn't unbuckle immediately. Can I ask something? She said. Claire turned off the engine. Of course. Annie picked at the sleeve of her cardigan. If the judge says yes, does that mean Mom won't be my mom anymore? Claire felt the air shift. No, she said carefully. It means I become your mom too. Annie frowned slightly. But people only have one. Claire shook her head gently. Some people do. Some people have more. Families don't all look the same. Annie considered that, but her eyes remained clouded. That evening, Maria came to dinner. It had become a quiet routine once a week, no ceremony, no announcement. Just shared food and conversation. Maria still tied her hair back when she entered the main house. Still moved with the same disciplined posture. But she no longer felt like staff at the table. She felt like something else, something undefined. Annie sat between Claire and Maria, unusually quiet. Halfway through the meal, she put down her fork. "What if I forget something?" she asked. Maria looked at her gently. "Forget what?" "How it used to be," Annie replied. The adults exchanged glances. "You won't forget," Maria said softly. "But what if I do?" Annie insisted. "What if I start liking it here too much?" The room went still. Ethan set his napkin down carefully. "You're allowed to like it here," he said gently. Annie shook her head. "But if I like it more?" Maria reached for her daughter's hand. "You are not choosing between us," Maria said firmly. Annie's eyes filled slightly. "It feels like I am." Claire's heart tightened. After dinner, Annie excused herself and went upstairs earlier than usual. Maria stood at the sink, rinsing plates automatically, though Claire had told her she didn't need to. "She's afraid," Maria said quietly. Claire nodded. "Of losing you." Maria's jaw tightened slightly. "Or of replacing me." Ethan leaned against the counter, listening. "She asked me yesterday," Maria continued, voice lower now. "If I would still tuck her in sometimes." Claire swallowed hard. "And what did you say?" she asked. "I told her yes," Maria answered. "But I don't know what that will look like." Silence settled between them. Ethan finally spoke. "This isn't about replacing anyone." Maria's eyes flicked toward him. "It never is. Until it is." Claire shook her head. "I don't want to take your place." Maria studied her carefully. "Then don't." Upstairs, Annie sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall. There were framed prints, now soft watercolor animals Claire had let her choose. A small lamp shaped like a moon. A bookshelf half filled with her things, half with books that had once waited untouched. She picked up a framed photo from her nightstand. It was from 3 years ago, just her and Maria at a county fair. Cotton candy in Annie's hand. Maria laughing at something off camera. Annie pressed the photo to her chest. A soft knock came at her door. "Can I come in?" Ethan asked. She nodded. He sat at the edge of the bed, not too close. "You've been quiet tonight," he said gently. Annie stared at the carpet. "Do you ever miss things?" she asked. He considered the question. "Yes," he said honestly. "All the time." "Even if you get something new?" she pressed. "Yes." Annie looked up. "Does that make you a bad person?" The vulnerability in her voice made his chest ache. "No," he said firmly. "It makes you human." She studied him. "What if I love both?" she whispered. Ethan felt something steady rise inside him. "Then you're lucky," he said softly. Annie's brow furrowed. "But what if someone gets less?" Ethan shook his head gently. "Love isn't pie," he said. "It doesn't shrink when you share it." Annie considered that. "But it feels different," she admitted. "It should," he replied. "Different doesn't mean smaller." She held the photo tighter. "Mom taught me how to tie my shoes," she said quietly. "She knows what I'm scared of before I say it." Ethan nodded. "I can't replace that," he said. Annie looked at him carefully. "Are you trying to?" He met her eyes. "No." The words settled with clarity. After a moment, Annie scooted slightly closer, not into his arms, not fully leaning, but closer. "I don't want her to feel like I picked you," she said. Ethan's voice softened. "She didn't raise you to pick," he said. "She raised you to grow." Annie thought about that for a long time. Downstairs, Claire and Maria sat across from each other in the living room, untouched tea cooling on the table between them. Maria broke the silence first. "She is afraid of loving you," she said quietly. Claire's breath caught. "Why?" "Because loving you might mean needing you," Maria replied. The truth was sharp but not cruel. Claire nodded slowly. "I won't compete with you." Maria's gaze softened just slightly. "Good." A few minutes later, Annie came downstairs holding the framed photo. She walked straight to Maria and climbed into her lap like she had done 1,000 times before. "I'm not leaving," she whispered. Maria held her tightly. "I know," she murmured. Annie looked over Maria's shoulder at Claire. Then she reached out one hand. Claire stepped forward and took it gently. 3 hands connected, not replacing, not subtracting, expanding. For the first time since the process began, the fear of replacement felt named and diminished. Upstairs later that night, Ethan crossed off day 32. The stars on the calendar were filling in. Temporary was no longer about where Annie slept. It was about whether everyone could trust that love would not erase what came before. And for the first time, it felt possible. Day 44. The calendar above the refrigerator was nearly half filled with blue stars. Annie insisted on crossing off each square herself every evening, standing on a stool with a marker clutched tightly in her hand. She pressed hard enough to leave faint dents in the paper. 16 more, she announced that night. Maria smiled softly from the kitchen doorway. You make it sound like a countdown to Christmas. Annie considered that. It kind of is. But Christmas carried certainty. This did not. The waiting period had settled into their lives like background noise always present, rarely spoken about directly. Interviews had been completed, financial statements reviewed, character references submitted. The social worker had returned twice, each visit gentler than the last. On the surface, everything looked promising. Underneath, doubt moved quietly. Ethan found himself waking earlier than usual. He would sit at the kitchen table before dawn, staring at the calendar as though it could predict the future if he studied it long enough. Claire noticed. You're doing that thing, she said one morning, placing a mug of coffee in front of him. What thing? He asked. The silent catastrophizing. He gave a faint smile. Is that what I'm doing? You're preparing for rejection, she said gently. Ethan leaned back in his chair. That's how I survive business. Claire rested her hand on his shoulder. This isn't business. He knew that, which was precisely why he felt so unprepared. Later that afternoon, a letter arrived from the court. The envelope bore the official seal, clean, neutral, intimidating. Maria was present when Ethan opened it. Claire stood close enough to hear the rustle of paper, but not close enough to see the words first. Annie lingered in the hallway, sensing the weight of adult silence. Ethan scanned the letter. Preliminary approval, he read aloud slowly. Final hearing scheduled in 14 days. Claire exhaled sharply. Maria closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. Steady. 14 days. Annie stepped forward cautiously. Is that good? Ethan nodded. It's very good. Annie looked from him to Maria. Does that mean it's happening? Maria crouched down in front of her daughter. It means we're almost at the last step, she said gently. Annie nodded, absorbing that. That night, after Maria returned to the staff apartment, Annie stood in the hallway outside the nursery, no longer a nursery, but her room. Ethan passed by and paused. You okay? He asked. She nodded, then shook her head. I don't know, she admitted. He leaned against the wall beside her. What's going on in that head? He asked softly. Annie took a breath. What if something changes in 14 days? He didn't dismiss the fear. Something might, he said honestly. Her eyes widened. But not what you're afraid of, he added quickly. She waited. The court could ask more questions, he explained, or paperwork could take longer. But that doesn't change how we feel. Annie studied him carefully. Feelings don't always stay, she said. The wisdom and weariness in her voice startled him. You're right, he said. Sometimes they don't. She looked down at her socks. But commitment does, he continued. Commitment stays even when feelings are scared or tired. Annie thought about that. Are you scared? She asked. Yes, he admitted. Why? Because I care, he answered simply. That seemed to make sense to her. The next few days passed with unusual gentleness. Claire took Annie shopping for a new dress for the hearing, nothing extravagant, just a soft blue one with tiny white flowers. Annie insisted Maria help pick it. They stood together in the dressing room, Maria adjusting the hem while Claire held the hanger. You look beautiful, Claire said. Annie looked uncertain. Like I belong, Maria met her eyes in the mirror. You always belonged, she said firmly. The distinction mattered. At school, Annie's teacher pulled Ethan aside one afternoon. She seems more confident, the teacher said. But she's also cautious. Ethan nodded. She's waiting. For what? The teacher asked. For permanence, he replied. The teacher smiled faintly. Most adults are too. On day 53, Annie didn't draw her star right away. She stood in front of the calendar, marker in hand, but didn't move. What if I stop counting? She asked quietly. Ethan crouched beside her. Why would you? Because if I count, and it doesn't happen, I'll know exactly how long I waited. The fear was raw now. Close to the surface, he rested his hand lightly on her back. If it doesn't happen on day 60, he said gently, we'll keep counting. She looked at him. We will? Yes. Until what? Until it's done right. She stared at the calendar again. Then she drew the star. Day 53. That night, Claire found Ethan in the study reviewing the court packet again. You've read that 3 times, she said softly. 4, he corrected. Claire walked around the desk and sat on the edge of it. Do you regret starting this? She asked quietly. He looked up sharply. No. Even if it hurts? He didn't hesitate. Yes, he said. Even if it hurts. Claire nodded slowly. I don't want Annie to feel like she's on trial, she said. She isn't, Ethan replied. Claire held his gaze. Then make sure we aren't either. He understood. The waiting period was not a test of Annie's worth. It was a test of their steadiness. On day 59, the house felt unnaturally still. Even the clocks seemed quieter. Annie sat on the living room floor coloring, but her crayons barely moved. Maurice arrived early and stayed longer than usual. Claire baked cookies no one really ate. Ethan walked through each room once, twice, as if memorizing the space before it changed. That night, Annie climbed into bed and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow, she whispered. Claire brushed her hair back gently. Yes. Annie turned to Ethan. Will you still be here when I wake up? He didn't smile. Yes, he said firmly. She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. Okay. After she fell asleep, Ethan stood at the doorway and listened to her breathing. Day 59 was ending. Temporary was almost over. But the truth was this. The waiting had already changed them. It had stripped away performance. It had exposed fear. It had forced honesty. And as Ethan turned off the hallway light and walked back toward his bedroom, he understood something quietly but completely. The court might finalize the adoption, but the family had already chosen each other. Day 60 arrived without ceremony. No storm, no dramatic sunrise, just a clear Connecticut morning with cold air and pale light stretching across the Whitmore driveway. Annie woke before her alarm. For a moment she lay still, staring at the ceiling of the room that had once been a nursery and was now unmistakably hers. The soft blue dress with white flowers hung on the closet door. Waiting. Today. She sat up slowly and pressed her hand against the wall beside her bed. Still here. Across the hall, Ethan was already dressed in a charcoal suit, adjusting his cufflinks with hands steadier than he felt. He had negotiated hostile acquisitions with less tension than this. Claire stood in front of the mirror, fastening a simple pearl necklace, the same one she had worn to every fertility appointment, as if consistency could anchor hope. Maria arrived just after 8. She wore a navy blazer Annie had never seen before. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her posture immaculate. She did not look like an employee. She looked like a mother preparing to hand over something sacred and still keep it. The drive to Hartford was quieter than usual. Annie sat between Claire and Maria in the back seat this time. Ethan drove. The courthouse rose ahead, gray stone, tall columns, American flag lifting gently in the morning wind. It wasn't intimidating. It was official. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished floors and old paper. Families filled the waiting area, some celebrating, some nervous, some silent like them. Annie squeezed Maria's hand. Is this where judges live? She whispered. Maria smiled softly. No, Mija, just where they work. Ethan checked in at the clerk's desk. Their names were called 20 minutes later. Courtroom 3B. The room was smaller than Ethan expected. No dramatic gallery, no raised voices. Just a judge's bench, a few rows of seating, and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. Judge Harrison was in her early 60s, silver hair cut neatly, glasses resting low on her nose. She carried herself with calm authority, the kind that came from decades of listening to complicated stories. Good morning, she said evenly. Everyone rose, then sat. Ethan felt Annie's small hand slide into his. He didn't look down. He just held it. The clerk reviewed the case number. Petition for adoption, Whitmore. Judge Harrison scanned the file briefly before looking up. I've reviewed the home study, she began. Financial disclosures are complete. Background checks clear. Ms. Hernandez has provided informed consent pending final confirmation today. Maria's spine straightened slightly at her name. Judge Harrison removed her glasses and folded them carefully. "Before I make any ruling," she said, "I need to ask a few questions." She turned first to Maria. "Ms. Hernandez, do you understand that once this adoption is finalized, Ethan and Claire Whitmore will become Annie's legal parents?" Maria's voice was steady. "Yes, Your Honor. Do you consent freely and without coercion?" "Yes." Judge Harrison studied her face for a long moment. "And do you believe this is in your daughter's best interest?" Maria's eyes flicked briefly toward Annie. "Yes," she said again, softer this time. "I do." The judge nodded. She then turned to Ethan and Claire. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, adoption is not an act of charity," she said calmly. "It is a lifelong obligation. Do you understand that?" "Yes, Your Honor," Ethan replied. Claire's voice followed. "We do." Judge Harrison's gaze sharpened slightly. "You understand that this child's identity includes her history, her culture, her relationship with her biological mother." Ethan did not hesitate. "We do," Claire added gently. "We honor it." The judge's expression softened just slightly. Finally, she looked at Annie. "Annie," she said kindly, "would you like to come stand up here with me?" Annie hesitated. Ethan felt the tension in her fingers. "It's okay," Claire whispered. Annie walked slowly to the front, her blue dress brushing against her knees. Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly so her voice felt less distant. "Do you know why you're here today?" she asked gently. Annie nodded. "Because we're deciding if I get to stay." A faint murmur moved through the room. Judge Harrison smiled softly. "And what do you want?" Annie looked back at Maria first, then at Claire, then at Ethan. She swallowed. "I just want someone to stay," she said. The words were simple, but they filled the courtroom completely. Ethan felt his chest tighten so sharply he had to steady his breathing. Judge Harrison nodded slowly. "That's a very honest answer," she said. She sat back, lifted her gavel lightly, not striking it yet, and spoke with calm finality. "Based on the documentation provided, the consent of Miss Hernandez, and the expressed wishes of the child, this court grants the petition for adoption." The gavel came down once, clear, decisive, effective immediately, she continued. "Annie Hernandez is legally Annie Whitmore." The room seemed to tilt for a second. Claire inhaled sharply. Maria closed her eyes briefly, not in loss, but in release. Ethan felt Annie's hand tighten around his again. He knelt instinctively as she turned toward him. "Dad," she whispered, not testing, not questioning, stating. He pulled her into his arms. "Yes," he answered, voice unsteady but certain. "I'm here." Claire wrapped her arms around both of them. Maria stepped forward after a moment and placed her hand on Annie's back. No one was erased. No one was replaced. Judge Harrison watched quietly before adding one final note. "Remember," she said gently, "paperwork creates structure. Love creates family." Ethan nodded, absorbing the truth of it. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, not lighter, just grounded. Annie stood between the three adults who had chosen her and whom she had chosen back. "Does this mean it's forever now?" she asked. Ethan crouched down so they were eye to eye. "It means we don't count days anymore," he said. Annie smiled. For the first time in 60 days, there was no calendar waiting at home to measure uncertainty. There was only a house and a family. The word echoed long after the gavel struck. Granted, it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it carried the kind of finality Ethan had spent his entire career negotiating. This time, there was no counteroffer. Outside the courthouse, the wind had softened. The American flag above the entrance moved gently against a pale winter sky. Families filtered down the stone steps in small clusters, some laughing, some crying, some stunned into silence. Annie stood between Ethan and Claire, her small hand gripping his tightly. "Does this mean my name changed already?" she asked. Ethan smiled faintly. "Legally?" "Yes." She looked thoughtful. "Do I have to write it differently at school?" Claire laughed softly through lingering tears. "Only the last part." Annie tested it quietly under her breath. "Annie Whitmore," she said it once, then again, not as replacement, as addition. Maria stood slightly to the side, watching carefully, not detached, not excluded, just giving the moment room to breathe. Annie turned suddenly and ran back up the courthouse steps. "Wait," Claire called instinctively, but Annie wasn't running away. She ran straight to Maria, and wrapped her arms around her waist. "I'm still yours," she said firmly. Maria dropped to her knees and held her tightly. "You always will be," she whispered. Ethan watched the exchange with something close to reverence. No victory, no loss, just expansion. After a few minutes, they walked together toward the car. No press waited outside. No cameras. Ethan had quietly ensured that this moment belonged only to them. On the drive home, Annie sat in the front seat beside Ethan this time. "I get to sit here now?" she asked. "You always could," he replied. She buckled herself in carefully. At a stoplight, she looked over at him. "Dad." The word came easily now. "Yes. Does it feel different?" He considered the question seriously. "Yes," he said. "It feels official." She nodded thoughtfully, like when the teacher signs your paper and it counts. He smiled. Exactly like that. Back at the house, the front door opened to familiar air. But something had shifted. It wasn't the furniture. It wasn't the walls. It was the weight. Temporary had lifted. Annie walked in first. She paused in the foyer and looked around as if seeing it for the first time. "Is this really mine?" she asked quietly. Ethan stepped beside her. "It's ours," he corrected gently. Claire moved toward the kitchen. "I think this calls for something sweet," she said, pulling out ingredients for a cake she hadn't baked in years. Maria lingered near the doorway. "You don't have to leave," Claire said softly. Maria shook her head. "I'm not leaving. I'm just adjusting." Ethan approached her carefully. "Thank you," he said. Maria's eyes flicked to his. "For what?" "For trusting us." She studied him for a long moment. "Don't thank me yet," she replied quietly. "Raise her well. Then thank me." He nodded once. "I will." Upstairs, Annie walked into her room slowly. No hesitation. No testing the walls. She opened the closet and ran her hand across the hanging dresses. Then she walked to the nightstand and picked up the framed photo of her and Maria at the fair. She placed it carefully beside a new photo Claire had printed that morning, one from the courthouse steps, all four of them together. 2 frames, side by side. Downstairs, Claire mixed batter, while Ethan set the table unnecessarily neatly. Annie came down carrying both photos. "Can we put them here?" she asked, pointing to the living room shelf. Claire's eyes softened. "Yes." Ethan helped her position them carefully. When the cake came out of the oven, it wasn't perfect. Slightly uneven. A little cracked on top. No one cared. They stood around the kitchen island as Claire sliced the first piece. "Should we make a speech?" Annie asked seriously. Ethan chuckled. "I think you just did." Annie looked at Maria. "Can you still tuck me in sometimes?" she asked quietly. Maria swallowed. "If you ask." Annie nodded. Then she turned to Claire. "Can you still brush my hair?" Claire smiled through tears. "Every night." Annie looked at Ethan last. "And you?" He leaned down slightly. "I'll still be here when you wake up," he said. That seemed to satisfy her. Later that evening, after Maria returned to the staff apartment and the dishes were washed, Ethan stood alone in the living room. This was the same room where, 60 nights ago, he had sat in the dark whispering apologies to a future he believed would never arrive. Now, faint laughter drifted down the hallway as Claire read Annie a bedtime story. Ethan walked slowly to the armchair where it had all begun. He sat down. The room was not silent anymore. Footsteps padded down the hallway. Annie appeared, hair damp from her bath, pajama sleeves slightly too long. "Dad?" "Yes?" She walked over and climbed into his lap without asking permission. "Is it okay if I'm happy?" she asked. He felt the question land softly but firmly. "Yes," he said. She studied his face carefully. "Even if it makes other people sad?" He understood what she meant. He held her a little tighter. "Love doesn't take away," he said quietly. "It adds." She rested her head against his chest. After a moment, she whispered the word again. "Dad." Not testing, not checking. Belonging. Ethan closed his eyes and let himself feel it fully. Granted, not just by the court, but by choice. The first morning after the adoption did not arrive with fanfare. There were no balloons, no banners, no dramatic shift in the air. There was only sunlight, soft and steady, spilling across Annie's bedroom floor in long golden lines. Annie woke slowly, blinking at the ceiling. For a moment, she lay still, not because she was afraid, because she didn't have to check. She turned her head toward the doorway. It was open, just like every other night. She listened. Downstairs, she heard the faint clink of dishes, the low murmur of voices, the smell of coffee and something warm cinnamon, maybe drifted faintly into the hallway. She sat up. No rush, no panic, no testing the wall. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and padded into the hall. Ethan stood in the kitchen wearing a navy sweater instead of a suit jacket. Claire stood beside the stove, flipping pancakes, real ones, not from a box. Maria sat at the table, already dressed for work, her hands wrapped around a mug. The scene stopped Annie mid-step. It looked normal. Ethan glanced up first. "Morning," he said. Annie tilted her head. "Morning," she replied carefully. She walked to the table and climbed into a chair. No one announced anything. No one said, "This is your first day as a Whitmore." Claire placed a plate in front of her. "Extra cinnamon," she said softly. Annie looked at Maria. "Are you staying?" she asked. Maria nodded. "For breakfast." Annie exhaled without realizing she had been holding her breath. Ethan poured orange juice into 4 glasses. He set one in front of Annie last, not because she was least important, but because he wanted her to see that she was included in the rhythm. Annie picked up her fork, then paused. "Do I still go to school?" she asked. Claire smiled gently. "Yes." Annie frowned slightly. "Even though something big happened?" Ethan chuckled softly. Especially then. Life, he knew, did not pause for milestones. It absorbed them. After breakfast, Annie went upstairs to brush her teeth. Ethan watched her climb the stairs with a steadiness that hadn't been there 60 days ago. Maria stood slowly, smoothing her blazer. "I'll head to work," she said. Annie ran back down before Maria reached the door. "Wait." Maria turned. Annie wrapped her arms around her tightly. "See you after school?" Annie asked. Maria nodded. "Always." Ethan stood near the foyer, observing the exchange with something close to awe. There was no pulling apart, no competition, just continuity. After Maria left, Claire gathered Annie's backpack. "Ready?" she asked. Annie hesitated at the threshold. "Dad?" Ethan looked down at her. "Yes? Does it feel different this morning?" He considered that carefully. "Yes," he said. "How?" He crouched to her height. "Because today I don't have to hope anymore," he replied quietly. "I get to build." Annie thought about that. "Build what?" "A life," he said simply. She nodded, satisfied. At school drop-off, Annie stepped out of the car and turned back before closing the door. "You'll be here when I come home?" she asked. Ethan met her eyes. "Yes." She studied his face for a second longer than necessary. Then she closed the door and walked toward the entrance without looking back. Claire watched her disappear inside. "She didn't check twice," Claire whispered. Ethan nodded. "She doesn't have to anymore." Back at the house, the silence felt different than it had months ago. It wasn't hollow. It was temporary in the right way, the kind that waited for footsteps to return. Ethan wandered upstairs to Annie's room. He stood in the doorway and looked around. The twin bed, the watercolor prints, the 2 framed photographs on the nightstand Maria at the fair, the courthouse steps, side by side. He walked to the rocking chair that had remained through every version of this room. He sat in it slowly. It creaked under his weight. For years, it had symbolized something unfinished. Now it felt like something reclaimed. He let it rock once, twice, then he stilled it. Downstairs, Claire moved through the kitchen, humming softly. The house no longer felt like a museum. It felt lived in. That afternoon, Annie burst through the front door with an energy that had been building all day. "Dad," she called. Ethan stepped into the foyer. "Yes?" She grinned widely. "I wrote my new name." He smiled. "How'd it feel?" She shrugged, trying to look casual. "Like it fits." Claire stepped forward. "And if someone asks?" she prompted gently. Annie lifted her chin slightly. "I'll tell them it's my family, and that's enough." Ethan felt pride rise in his chest, quiet, grounded, not because of the name, because of the confidence. That night, after homework and dinner, Annie climbed into bed without hesitation. Claire brushed her hair. Ethan stood in the doorway. "Good night," Claire said. Annie smiled. "Good night, Mom." The word came out softly, natural. Claire froze for only half a second before responding. "Good night, sweetheart." Annie turned toward Ethan. "Good night, Dad." He didn't need to steady himself this time. "Good night." When the lights were off and the hallway quiet, Ethan and Claire stood together outside Annie's room. Claire exhaled slowly. "It's done," she whispered. Ethan shook his head gently. "No," he said. It's starting, and for the first time in 10 years, the house did not feel like it was waiting for a child. It felt like a child lived there. The first Sunday after the adoption felt different before anyone said it out loud. There was something steady in the air that morning. Not excitement, not relief. Something quieter, belonging. Claire woke early and stood in the kitchen, tying on an apron she hadn't worn in years. She moved with deliberate, calm measuring flour, setting out butter to soften, pulling vegetables from the refrigerator. Ethan entered in jeans and a worn sweater instead of the pressed suits that used to define his weekends. "You're cooking like it's Thanksgiving," he observed gently. Claire smiled faintly. "Maybe it is." He leaned against the counter, watching her knead dough for homemade rolls. "Your mother used to do this," he said quietly. Claire glanced up. "Every Sunday?" "Every Sunday," he confirmed. Didn't matter how busy the week had been. We sat down together. She nodded. "Then we're doing it right," she said. Upstairs, Annie padded into the hallway in fuzzy socks, drawn by the smell of cinnamon and roasted chicken. "Is it a holiday?" she asked when she reached the kitchen. Ethan smiled. "No." Annie tilted her head. "Then why does it smell important?" Claire laughed softly. "Because sometimes ordinary days deserve good food." Annie considered that and climbed onto a stool. "Can I help?" Claire handed her a wooden spoon. "Stir gently." Annie stirred with fierce concentration, as if she'd been entrusted with something sacred. Around noon, Maria arrived carrying a small aluminum tray wrapped in foil. "You didn't have to bring anything," Claire said warmly. Maria lifted one eyebrow. "In my family, you never show up empty-handed." Ethan stepped forward to take the tray. "What is it?" "Rice and beans," Maria replied. "The way my mother made them." Annie's eyes lit up. "They're the good kind," she declared proudly. Ethan smiled. "Then they belong at this table." The dining room felt fuller than it ever had, not because of numbers, because of presence. Annie insisted on setting the table herself. She placed the forks unevenly and corrected them twice before stepping back to inspect her work. "Looks official," she said. Maria watched quietly, something thoughtful in her expression. When they finally sat down, Ethan at the head out of habit, Claire to his right, Maria to his left, Annie between both women. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was respectful. Ethan cleared his throat slightly. "When I was a boy," he began, "my father used to say something before Sunday dinner." Annie leaned forward immediately. "What?" He hesitated, then spoke the words slowly. He'd say, "What we build at this table lasts longer than what we build at work." Maria's gaze lifted. Claire's fingers tightened around her napkin. Annie looked around the table carefully. "Then we're building something," she said. "Yes," Ethan replied. "We are." They began passing dishes, Claire's roast chicken, Maria's rice and beans, Annie's slightly uneven rolls. Halfway through the meal, Annie looked up suddenly. "Can we say something?" she asked. Claire smiled. "Of course." Annie straightened in her chair. "I'm glad I don't have to pack a bag anymore," she said simply. Silence fell, but not heavy. Maria reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. "You never had to," she said softly. Annie shook her head gently. "I thought I did." Ethan felt the truth of that settle deep. After dessert apple pie Claire had baked from scratch, they moved to the living room. Annie climbed onto the rug with a deck of cards. "Go fish?" she suggested. Ethan joined her without hesitation. Maria and Claire sat on the couch, watching as Annie dealt unevenly. "Do you remember," Claire said quietly to Maria, "when she first came into this house?" She barely spoke. Maria nodded. She thought quiet meant safe. Claire swallowed. "And now?" she asked. Maria's gaze shifted to Annie, laughing as Ethan exaggerated his disappointment over a bad hand. "Now she's loud," Maria said softly. Claire smiled. "Good." As the afternoon light shifted toward evening, Annie crawled into Ethan's lap again, comfortable, unguarded. "Dad?" she asked. "Yes? Will we always have Sunday dinner?" Ethan glanced at Claire, then at Maria. "Yes," he said firmly. "Even when you're taller than me." Annie giggled. "That's impossible." He raised an eyebrow. "We'll see." Maria stood to leave just before dusk. Annie walked her to the door. "I'll see you tomorrow?" Annie asked. "Yes," Maria replied. Annie hesitated. Then she said it clearly, confidently. "Good night, Mom." Maria's composure cracked just slightly. "Good night, Mija." Ethan stood back, giving them space. When the door closed gently behind Maria, Annie turned and walked back into the house without looking uncertain. She didn't check the walls. She didn't measure the air. She simply climbed onto the couch beside Claire and leaned into her shoulder. The television hummed softly in the background. Some old football game Ethan barely watched. He looked around the room. Shoes by the door, a half-finished puzzle on the coffee table, crumbs from pie on a napkin Annie had forgotten to throw away. Evidence of life, not performance, not optics, not charity, family. Claire rested her head against his shoulder. "You feel it?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he replied. Annie looked up sleepily. "Feel what?" Ethan smiled down at her. "Home," he said, and for the first time in a very long time, the word meant exactly what it should. Spring arrived quietly in Connecticut. The last traces of winter melted from the edges of the Whitmore lawn, and the trees that had stood bare through storms and waiting began to bud again, small green promises against pale branches. It had been 3 months since the courtroom. 3 months since the word granted had shifted from legal language into lived reality. Annie no longer counted days. The calendar on the refrigerator had been replaced with a new one, this time filled with school events, dentist appointments, and a circled date for family picnic she had insisted they schedule. Life had not become perfect. It had become ordinary. And ordinary, Ethan had learned, was a gift. On a Saturday afternoon, Annie sat at the dining room table working on a school assignment titled, My Family. Crayons were scattered everywhere. Claire sat nearby reading. Ethan reviewed a document but found himself watching Annie instead. "What are you writing?" he asked gently. Annie didn't look up. "About us." Ethan leaned back slightly. She printed carefully, tongue peeking out at the corner of her mouth in concentration. "My name is Annie Whitmore," she read aloud slowly as she wrote. "I have a mom, a dad, and another mom." Claire smiled faintly. Annie paused. "Should I say adopted?" she asked. The room stilled for a moment. Ethan considered the question carefully. "Do you want to?" he asked. Annie shrugged. "It's part of the story." Claire nodded gently. "Then write it the way it feels true to you." Annie thought for a long moment. Then she added one more sentence. "I was chosen." She didn't say it dramatically. She didn't look up for approval. She simply wrote it and continued coloring. Ethan felt something steady and deep settle in his chest. Chosen. Not saved. Not rescued. Chosen. Later that evening, Maria joined them for dinner again. It was no longer an event. It was simply routine. Annie ran to her with a paper in hand. "Look," she said proudly. Maria adjusted her glasses and read silently. Her eyes lingered on the final line. "I was chosen." Maria swallowed slowly. "You were," she said softly. Every day. After dinner, Annie tugged at Ethan's sleeve. "Can we go outside?" she asked. The sun was beginning to dip low, casting long golden streaks across the lawn. They stepped onto the porch together. The air smelled like new grass and something blooming faintly nearby. Annie sat on the top step, swinging her legs. "Dad?" "Yes." "Do you still cry at night?" The question caught him off guard, but not painfully. "No," he said honestly. "Why not?" He looked out at the trees. "Because I'm not apologizing to the dark anymore." Annie tilted her head. "What does that mean?" He smiled faintly. "It means I used to talk to things I didn't have. Now I talk to what's here." She considered that quietly. Then she leaned her head against his arm. "I'm glad I woke up that night," she said softly. He exhaled slowly. "So am I." They sat there in comfortable silence until Claire joined them, wrapping a light sweater around Annie's shoulders. Maria stood just inside the doorway, watching without interrupting. The scene was simple. 3 adults, 1 child, no grand speeches, no dramatic declarations, just presence. As dusk settled, Annie looked up at Ethan again. "Will you tell me the story?" she asked. "Which one?" he replied. "The one about when I asked you." He nodded slowly. He had told it before, but it felt different now. "You walked into the kitchen," he began quietly. "You were supposed to be asleep." Annie smiled slightly. "I was hungry." "Yes," he agreed. "And I was sitting at the table, thinking about things I thought I'd never have." She studied his face. "And I asked you if you wanted to adopt a child," she said. He nodded. "And you called me Dad," he added softly. Annie grinned. "You looked surprised." "I was," he admitted. "I had spent years believing that word didn't belong to me." She leaned closer. "And now?" He looked at her, really looked at her. Now it wasn't a question. Now it was a fact. Now it stays, he said. Annie seemed satisfied with that. Inside, Maria cleared plates while Claire folded napkins. Ethan watched the light fade across the yard and realized something that would have once frightened him. The house was no longer waiting for anything. It wasn't holding space for a future child. It wasn't echoing with absence. It was filled, not just with noise, with story, with resilience, with a 6-year-old girl who had walked into his grief and offered him a word he had been afraid to claim. Dad. The porch light flickered on automatically as the sky deepened into blue. Annie yawned. Time for bed, Claire said gently. Annie stood and slipped her hand into Ethan's. They walked inside together. At the staircase, Annie paused and looked back at the living room, the photos on the shelf, the worn armchair, the calendar on the wall. No checking, no measuring, just seeing. She turned back to him. I'm glad you said yes, she whispered. He knelt so they were eye level. I'm glad you asked, he replied. Upstairs, Claire tucked Annie in. Maria stood in the doorway tonight too, just watching. Good night, Mom, Annie said softly. Good night, sweetheart, Claire answered. Good night, Mom, Annie added, looking at Maria. Maria stepped forward and kissed her forehead. Sleep well. Finally, Annie looked at Ethan. Good night, Dad. The word was no longer fragile. It didn't tremble. It didn't test. It rested. Good night, he said. When the lights were off and the hallway quiet, Ethan stood alone for a moment outside Annie's room. Months ago, he had sat in the dark whispering apologies for a life that felt incomplete. Now, he stood in a house where a child slept without fear of being moved. He didn't whisper anything. He didn't need to, because some words, once spoken at the right time, don't fade. They stay. And in that quiet hallway, Ethan Whitmore understood fully. The question had changed his life, but the answer had built it. This story reminds us that family is not built by blood alone, but by commitment. Love is not proven in grand gestures or legal documents. It is proven in who stays when it is hard, in who shows up the next morning, and in who chooses each other again and again. The greatest wounds in life often come from feeling unwanted or temporary. And the greatest healing comes from hearing, I'm not leaving. For those who have known loss, injustice, or the fear of being unseen, this story speaks to a quiet truth. Belonging is not given by circumstance, it is created through courage, humility, and the decision to stand firm in love. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.